Okay, so these are the 3 points that I'm going to look at. What are the challenges for rural and Indigenous communities? So I'm going to run through some of the key drivers of deforestation in that section. Then I'm going to focus in on what COP, the Glasgow conference last year, what it actually did on land and nature. So there's a few of the outcomes that are specifically really relevant to land rights and land tenure security, which is the Glasgow Leaders Declaration on forest and land use, and a few other areas as well. And then I'll have a look at what opportunities there are for lawyers to work creatively and to form part of the land rights solution. So I just wanted to start with this graphic because I think it's very confronting, actually. This is a graphic of land loss in Borneo since the 1950s to 2020. And I think, if you take a look at that, it's a very confronting graphic, and it can give you an idea of just what of a big problem land use and deforestation is. So we now know that successful human tending, stewarding, and protection of intact forests, nature, and forest landscapes have now been directly linked with secure, formal, customary community tenure over land, territory, and resources. But by far the biggest challenge for securing land rights is deforestation and the conversion of land use, and related supply chains that back that up. The constant threat from the economic and political incentives for deforestation are a major barrier to securing community land rights and sustaining those land rights over the long term. So what drives deforestation? Well, that's a very, very complex area. I'll just give you a flavor. Obviously, it differs from region to region and from country to country. But there are some general ones which lawyers will be quite familiar with, lawyers in the private practice area and in the charity sector, NGO sector. And these ones have a particular legal flavor. So there's the economic angle, which can often be lost, I think, in the land rights, securing land rights conversation. So international trade and supply chains. Obviously, the EU and the UK are major importers of commodities like palm oil, soya, beef, cocoa, rubber, timber. They're all associated with deforestation and the destruction of natural ecosystems. National, regional, and international laws which aim to remove deforestation risk from international trade supply chains do remain weak. There are some inroads that are coming in the UK. The Environmental Act last year that came into force in the UK covers some of this. And also there's the EU has got some proposals, regulations on deforestation, so that's making some inroads there, but there's still a long way to go, and there are quite a few gaps which I'll discuss in a bit more detail when we get to the legal aspects. Investment pipelines, development projects. Well, this is more of a bigger contextual look. National policies for expanding infrastructure, road, telecoms, natural resource extraction, increasingly going into forested areas where land rights of local and vulnerable people is not fully recognised by national governments. And even if it is recognised, the economic incentives of these projects are just so seductive that the land tenure or forest rights just become displaced and they're not enforced. So in terms of public regulation, we have things like the business human rights related due diligence, for instance, under the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. But these rarely, if ever, regulate these types of really complex transactions with very strong extraterritorial complexity. And what you tend to see is that a lot of the regulation there falls to social safeguarding standards, which development finance institutes, environmental and social standards, they're very problematic. You look at ombudsman mechanisms, and there's still so many complaints of Indigenous encroachment onto Indigenous land. So something is going very wrong in that area. And then, of course, there's the financial mechanisms that drive all of the above supply chains. Money, you have to follow the money, leads to the system of national, international development finance that drive deforestation through easy financing with poor or no due diligence. So that's, major financial centers, looking at some of the world's major financial centers and how they are unwittingly, maybe through poor anti-money laundering, environmental crime, safeguarding compliance mechanisms, they are contributing to that, and that's a big gap. So that could be an area of interest for lawyers. The political angle, I'll just, I'll gloss over that, but that's links as well to the economic angle, this need, this thirst for foreign direct investment, growth. There's problems in capacity imbalance in negotiations, the reduction of the state and the political will, lack of knowledge and resources, technical and financial. So the legal angle, as I've already kind of mentioned briefly, the issue of insecure legal security over land and underdeveloped land rights in so many countries. So I think we often hear about cases at the national level in exporting countries that often have, weak rule of law, enforcement regimes. And we do hear of cases, for one example is, the Mayan case in Belize. After decades, the Mayan people had a victory with the Caribbean Court of Justice in 2015. There's been quite a few cases like that, recently the Saramaka, the Honduras case. The courts recognise these constant struggles which have been going on since colonial times and continue today through, struggles against timber, mining companies, natural resource companies, even now solar and wind power companies. And the Mayan case gave Indigenous land rights an equal value to Western property rights. So in other words, it based property rights on continued use and occupancy. And that becomes an example or a precedent for many other communities. But obviously those legal rulings aren't the end, right? They're just the beginning. And the question then is, how do you put this into practice? So, then you go into the mapping, the delineation process, resources, the political will. And lawyers, I think at this point can make quite a very good contribution here in developing the policies, the FPIC documents, helping draw up the regulations and the rights and the regulatory framework around consultation and inclusion that's needed once those cases have come through. I'll briefly touch on this. So what's going on at the EU and the UK level? So as I mentioned, the UK Environmental Act came into force last year, and that produced new environmental laws for tackling deforestation within supply chains. However, obviously those laws do not fill in the gaps of weak national legal and political recognition, but they work to exert some form of secondary pressure through requiring the supply chain traceability and corporate good governance. The EU as well has laws on deforestation, is now putting into force laws on deforestation-free supply chains, which also contains a due diligence and supply chain tracing requirements through reporting and certification. On the UK side, I won't comment too much on the EU one, but I'm a bit more familiar with the UK one. I think there's still some way to go in secondary legislation to come as to actually, what does this mean? Who is covered? What kind of corporations would be covered? The size of the corporations, and also what kind of commodities are going to be covered. One of the problems with the UK Environmental Act is that it restricts forest risk commodities that are produced illegally under producer country laws. So that leaves quite a big gap of activities that are taking place legally under local laws through, for example, state granted concessions, which don't require any due diligence around these kinds of issues when the permits are granted. So we kind of go back to the same kind of issue of the local laws being weak. We kind of repeat ourselves on that. And then the social angle to it as one of the challenges and the drivers of deforestation is this lack of really broad-based understanding really of the impacts of investments on deforestation and conversion supply chains, and on human rights issues, on displacement, and on heightening all the social and economic vulnerabilities. And I think that's, there's also the issue then that, what's happening under local laws under local regimes when defenders and resistors then are criminalized, and what that resistance that's coming from human rights defenders when they're criminalized, that is sending obviously the completely wrong message, that what they're doing is actually it's part of climate, it's part of just transition, it's part of climate action, and it's part of our biodiversity natural solutions. So what did COP do on land? Well, I think wherever you whatever the view is on COP, I think one thing it did do fairly well, and at least it started to make some progress on it, was break these kinds of silos, right, where lawyers think about CO2 reductions over there in Paris, and they think about oceans over there, and they think about biodiversity over there, and they don't really put them all together. I think COP, what it did make the progress on was looking at all of this holistically. So for land, I think the conference made progress in talking about climate change, land use, natural ecosystems, in a far more holistic manner. So it broke this silo, the silo about just talking about emissions there, natural biodiversity, in various different boxes. It made it very clear that halting deforestation is just as important and just as urgent as, getting these net zero emissions cuts down. And obviously the reason there is to prevent our biggest carbon sinks, which forests are, from being turned through land use, through these development projects, through investments, turning into huge actually carbon emitters. So countless studies have told us that rural and indigenous communities are actually the most effective conservation and biodiversity managers. They can design and implement natural solutions, and they treat forests as family, not as a resource to be extracted and to be exploited. So the work done on securing land rights can also help with preventing future global health pandemics. And that's an interesting point that has also come out of EU correspondence, I think, on the deforestation regulation. When I looked at some of the messages that came out, is this link between obviously human encroachment and removal of biodiversity, and then increasing global health pandemics, which the EU has picked up. When you're looking at all these challenges, one very actionable and scalable, but so far I think overlooked way of protecting forests is to protect, secure and sustain land tenure for rural and indigenous communities. It's a natural solution, and it's a scalable and effective pathway for reducing emissions and producing natural adapting programs and projects. So the Glasgow Pact itself referred for the first time, there was some specific reference to the importance of Indigenous rights and to sustainable land use, which I think it was a first that they have had these references in. So it's climbing up the political agenda. The Glasgow Leaders Declaration on Forests and Land Use was signed by more than 130 countries who work to collectively halt and reverse forest loss and land degradation by 2030. There was also a fact statement by the UK and Indonesia to support sustainable commodity producing and consuming countries. And I thought what was interesting was that all of this was backed up by a package of financial commitments. So that's actually, I think, let me just go over, here we go. The COP finance package, so these declarations were backed up with, well, very significant financial support. So we had $12 billion through public funding, 7 billion in private investments through philanthropic funds, and some of that is already channeling through. I think one of the issues will be what that looks like, what the plumbing of that looks like, right? So will it go through large donor organizations, which then impose large compliance issues? compliance mechanisms, or the better route would be for it to go in the form of direct access financing. But I think what's important is that Glasgow has taken that important step by prioritising and actually then allocating resources, right? And if you as we tend to follow the money in most things, by earmarking this as a priority, land tenure, land security, and then backing it up with money, I think there is, there's something there that I think we can be optimistic about. And as lawyers, I think we could, we can work on this together. Okay. Final things, just because they have legal perspective, and this is Lawyers Against Poverty, so they're a bit more generic. Two final points to note from COP, and basically the run up to COP as well, was this the really important role that lawyers have in playing in addressing climate actions. So one thing and if some of you have been following, but there have been various statements from the American Bar Association, from the International Bar Association, from the Law Society of England and Wales, which during COP released its resolution on climate change. And obviously, as the governing body for solicitors of England and Wales, they can only encourage us. But we all have professional obligations to uphold the rule of law. And what was interesting is that resolution encouraged lawyers to think about the rule of law and our professional obligations, and within that to advance efforts to strengthen climate justice and mitigate the climate crisis. So that's quite an interesting, I think, development for lawyers to think about. Ethical business, and I just brought this in because a lot of people, COP, whether was it just basically a corporate roadshow? Possibly, yes. One thing that's kind of come out of it is this kind of race to net zero. And recently there was a report, I think just a few days ago, that I glanced at, that I just like to flag, by Oxford University, that actually said, look, what does this, ethical business, responsible business, when businesses are now setting targets and net zero strategies and plans, and they're racing to this goal and the transition, there's the tendency for companies to just focus on offsets, right, which is a very, very controversial strategy, to say the least. But one thing that the Oxford paper came out with was, what would be a core part of an illegitimate strategy towards net zero: urgency, integrity, and sustainability. And the paper specifically states that legitimate net zero strategies are more than just isolated carbon offsets, they cannot work in silo, and that they should also cover initiatives. And they actually, they do specifically look at issues around biodiversity, public health, land use, local people's traditional livelihoods. So land is part of, or should at least be seen as part of a sustainable net zero strategy. So I thought that was quite an interesting development there to kind of contextualize land rights issues. So then the final bit, what lawyers can do to get involved. And I mean, as we kind of said at the beginning, what we're going to do here is, have a few, we appreciate this is, it's a complex topic, and there's lots of different aspects around land rights people might be interested in. So we'll start with having a few sessions from different speakers. And then, from that, we can, look at what kind of work you might like to be involved with, the pro bono initiative. Some of the few opportunities that I can see immediately for legal intervention, of course, these are very generic, but they could form part of a series of blogs, or a pro bono project on an actual case, or a combination of both. So, as I said, very generic, but just ideas. Lawyers with common or civil law backgrounds can lend expertise. and research to projects that focus on empowering communities to gain formal legal title to their land tenure. Lawyers can help expanding the policies, the documents, the legal frameworks that formally recognise Indigenous forest rights and land tenure. So that's actually with the actual legal regulatory drafting, or the policy that comes before that, or even a step before that. Yeah, you know, the FIPIC kind of documents. That could be an area that we could look at with potentially a pro bono NGO partner. For people that are maybe a bit more interested in the financing side or the compliance side, just transition land rights, and we could have a look at the kind of financing aspects around that. So around compliance, around finance. So if you're, for example, working in financial disclosures, you know, what could financial disclosures? I think it's quite clear that, well, yes. If this is an issue in projects for companies or for financial institutions, this is something that they should disclose. So, you know, investing in projects where there is a weak or very poor national regime around land tenure, or if there's some controversies around them, this could form part of the social disclosure. So that could be an aspect. And that might appeal to more of the corporate types of lawyers. Direct access finance mechanisms. This is an area that's, I think, probably over the medium to long term is going to come up. So, you know, what could they look like, right? That might require some really interesting and fundamental rethinking around what financial mechanisms could look like. So, for example, mechanisms that have negative interest rates, creation of an economy backed by social value. So these are, you know, I think this is we know that money is being channeled into these priority areas. So this could be, again, an area for lawyers to start thinking about, if that sounds interesting. And then there's narrative and strategy building, you know. Maybe there's, you know, would lawyers like to think about just writing more about, you know, around this momentum and around the legal initiatives through the language of climate change or climate justice, environmental law and human rights, as opposed to direct access calls to the protection of land rights. That's an interesting piece of work, and I'm not sure of the answer to this, right? So now that we are, you know, I think collectively as as human beings, I think we've moved into more of the, you know, climate, environmental, biodiversity. These are the urgent issues. So, you know, is there more work, strategy and narrative building to be done, which brings land rights as a solution to these problems and uses that as a legal strategy? And why do I suggest that? Well, I guess I'm suggesting that because human rights are coming into much closer conversation with environmental law at the international level. We had the resolution at the end of last year, the Human Rights Committee, I think it was. And obviously that's an international one, but that builds on, you know, over 150 domestic laws worldwide, which have some sort of law for protecting the environment and the right to a healthy environment. And far fewer have explicit legal protection for Indigenous people. So I wonder if that is something that is, you know, worth looking at here. And then when you segue that along with the climate and the environmental regulations that are coming from the EU and at the national levels around governance, supply chain, environmental safeguards and due diligence. So I wonder if, you know, if that's a neater way to bring land rights into this conversation, and maybe there's, you know, work, some legal strategy that could be done around that. And then of course there's, you know, amicus, you know, if there's any amicus, that's always something that lawyers like to do. Interventions, legal interventions, giving a hand with those. yeah, going forward, as I said, the first speaker we'll have is Lucy Claridge, and after that we'll have other speakers to hopefully look at different aspects and different kind of cross-dimensional. So it could be gender, land rights. Well, what would be great is to hear about, you know, what things you might be interested in. So I think I've spoken enough, and yeah, let's chat. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kinnari. I think open to the floor. Questions, thoughts, or contributions? Richard, your camera is on, so I'll nominate you.
Thanks, Emma, and thanks, Kinnari. Very interesting. Just a few brief thoughts from me. Some of you know me, but it's really good to meet the rest of you. I'm Richard Lord. I'm a commercial litigator and QC by background, but I'm also very interested in climate change, and I'm also chair of Action for Justice. And in that capacity and personal capacity, we're really interested in land rights in the global south. And slight being my bonnet being a tort litigator, I also think one has to look at a menu of legal redresses. It's sometimes easier to think of legal wrongs than legal rights, and it's easier to say someone is acting wrongly than establishing some sort of rather difficult human right. We're particularly interested in stopping land grabs and all that goes with them, and the fact that this is all really cross-cutting, and land issues mesh with, as we've heard, climate change issues, indigenous people's rights, environment, all sorts of environmental, social, and cultural rights. And we're interested in not academic theory so much as actually practical action that's useful, because again, as we've heard from Kinnari, there's so much gap between what the law is in theory and how it can be enforced on the ground. Just a few reactions from that really interesting talk for me. I think half or a quarter of me or a third of me feels optimistic that these measures, such as the Glasgow Declaration and the UK Act and the EU stuff, is starting to really bring traction and bringing some legal focus on it. The rest of me is a bit pessimistic because it's too little, too late, too slow. And it's so distant. If you talk to Indigenous people on the ground, as we try to do, and they go along to local court and talk about the UNGP, they get laughed out of court. And if they don't, they can't enforce it. So we very much, and I'd encourage this group as well to think perhaps in terms of multiple actions and angles of legal actions. It's complicated, it's not easy, but following the money, following the banks, the parent companies, things like the Global Canopy, Forest 500 of the drivers of deforestation, and really trying to apply those to add to the wisdom and skill and courage of those defending on the ground, and linking with international and northern lawyers who can help it. Anyway, that's enough for me, but those are some rather brief thoughts, but I'd love to connect with people afterwards. And if Kinnari is happy to do it, I'd love to get a copy of the slides, but enough from me, and I'll stop.
No, you're welcome. I think we'll put the slides up. We'll send the slides around, so that's no problem. Yeah, I totally agree with you. I think part of me feels it feels optimistic that okay, at least we've got some money now going, which, you know, if there's that signal, you follow the money, does that then signal, you know, changes in policies and in laws? But then it does, as you say, seems like a little bit too little and just too late, when we know that this has been going on for such a long time. Does anybody else have any questions or anything they'd like to add? Please don't be shy. This is we're all friends here, so whatever you'd like to, yeah. No.
I think we've got a question in the chat from
Oh.
Nana. A researcher and academic perspective. So could you suggest ways to contribute to protect the poor community in Ghana from not a practicing lawyer?
Well, I think lawyers don't have a monopoly on, getting involved, right, in this kind of work. So, please don't feel that we're putting up some kind of high barrier to entry, because that's not the point. So, how you can get involved, well, please come along to the next sessions, and, feel, after that, you're very welcome to join in, and whatever kind of project we put together. You're more than welcome, but you don't need to be a practicing lawyer. I think if you have passion and some time, those are all incredibly valuable skills.
And I just add, if I may, no, I agree with that. Even though I am a lawyer, we're only part of the solution. And in particular, getting facts and evidence is vital, and building networks on the ground, because very little legal action occurs without some sort of support from the communities affected, and some way of getting facts and witnesses and evidence and building momentum for a legal campaign. So I think that there's loads that anyone, including academic researchers, can do, and maybe we'll be exploring those, but it's not just the lawyers, even though this is a legal forum to some extent.
I mean, often, video evidence and testimonials and, this kinds of statements and, from local communities who suffer the impacts of these projects right on the ground, it's absolutely pivotal, right, and crucial to having those voices and to, getting the results and the impacts, right? It's that very, well, it's the human angle, right, which can which is very compelling as well. So bringing that kind of social dimension into the legal analysis is really, really important. So, having the local partners and hearing those voices, it gives the legitimacy and the credibility as well to the legal action, and makes it far more, robust. Anybody have anything else?
I say again, sorry to keep jumping in, but this time it's more a question, but I'd be really interested if anyone's willing to share their stories or interests, just because as I said, don't know everyone on the call. Emma, you may not. Kinnari, you may not. I'm just really interested to hear for anyone who wants to share it, even if it's only a couple of words or something on the chat, what's brought them to this webinar. I hope the answer isn't I've made a mistake.
Hi, everyone.
I've got. Okay.
No, you go ahead.
No, go first. I've got a code. You go ahead. I'll type my question in. I've got a bit of bad code, so go ahead.
Okay. Well, my name is Kezia, and I'm a newly qualified lawyer, and I've just joined the government legal department, and this came around. And I was really interested in joining, particularly because I haven't really seen the link before, as someone who's very new, between human rights and climate justice, and kind of looking at better protection for the environments going through human rights and land rights. That was something that I thought was a really interesting link that I hadn't seen before, and just wanted to hear a bit more about.
Great, thank you.
Well, again, if I do, Emma, do tell me to keep quiet, but it's a subject, Kezzy, I'm a bit passionate about, because as I say, I started my interest in climate litigation as a tort lawyer, and until about 10 years ago, nearly, no one really thought of it as a human rights issue, but it really is, because climate change impacts so many human rights, whether it's right to life, dignity, health, livelihood, land, and so on. And so increasingly the cases have been built around it. Some of them have been successful, some haven't, but it's that mix of the sense that certain people need to be accountable, and then looking from the other side, the whole section of people, and it's throughout the world, are suffering in a way that is impacting human rights, and in a way that governments and corporations can be held accountable. And so there's a really strong link now, and most of the cases that are being brought do have a human rights angle to them. And it's really interesting subject, and what's more, it's actually making a difference. And again, without going on a bit, there've been really exciting progress in Europe on some of the decisions that have been based on human rights. And why it's relevant in land is because the use of land and the lack of land is really important in reforesting and stopping deforestation. And climate change also impacts on people's land, because it often takes away its utility or floods it and so on.
Nana, would you like to, I think you unmuted yourself. I don't know if you'd like to say anything.
No, I was going to say that I see the link between land rights and human rights as very interrelated, because for my part of the world, Ghana, there are a lot of deforestation. The poor communities, their land are being taken over, and so I see that when I join these, I may be able to get more insight so that I can, join some of the projects to try and help them. So I see it as very, very much interrelated. Thank you.
Great.
Hi, can you hear me? My connection's a bit bad, but
Yes.
yes. So I also work at the government legal department as well. I'm an international lawyer, but at the moment I'm not working in anything to do with land rights and the environment, but it's something I'm interested in from when I previously did a master's in international law. And I am definitely more interested in the human rights aspect. But something I've been reading quite a bit about recently is kind of, so if we think of human rights as like the humanization of international law, whereas before it was thought of as just kind of governing relations between states, people are saying the next step could be this environmentalization of international law, where people think of the environment actually as an end in itself, which we need to protect. And that's kind of linking into this whole project with trying to get ecocide to be one of the international crimes in the Rome Statute. So that's kind of what I've been reading about, but kind of like what Richard said, I'm wondering whether there's quite a big gap between this is the theory that's coming out, but at the moment that's not really reflected at all in the practice. But other than that, I'm kind of more just in a listening capacity, because I don't have all that much experience in the field, but I am interested to become more involved.
Great. Anybody else like to chime in? No? Okay, I think and Richard, unless you want to, add anything else, I think we could probably bring this session to a close. Just to flag, the next session will be on the 10th of February, and there we'll have Lucy Claridge from, I think, Forest Peoples program that will speak to us. So yeah, please join us then. You're very, very welcome. And if you have any questions beforehand, don't hesitate to contact either myself or to contact Emma. And I'd just like to take this opportunity to say thank you to all of you for coming. Thank you for listening, and thank you for your interest. And yeah, we can share the slides, yeah, we hope to see you again soon. Thank you very much. Have a lovely evening.
That's great. And I just reiterate that for those who may think lots of people here are really expert and they're not,
No.
there's so much place for volunteers, and it's the interest in it that Action for Justice, Lawyers Against Poverty, it's all driven by people who are passionate about these things, bringing different skills and enthusiasms. You don't have to be a litigation lawyer to really help get involved. So as one of the first members of Lawyers Against Poverty, I'd really encourage people, even if they're sort of teetering about it, to stay involved, and also to give Lucy Claridge a big plug as well, because Justice Kinnari has done some great stuff. I've heard Lucy speak before and she's great as well.
So you have very low barriers to entry here. Well, just some passion and willingness, and yeah, great. Thank you very much.